11:15 on the night of February the 19th, 1969, two Class 37 locomotives idle at Healey Mills Depot, their engines turning over in the freezing dark. Snow has been falling across the Pennines for 6 hours straight. The forecast says it will not stop until morning. Somewhere between Huddersfield and Sheffield, the Penistone line is disappearing. Not dramatically, not in some sudden avalanche. Inch by inch, drift by drift, the rails are being buried. And if those rails vanish completely, they will not reappear until spring. Tonight, 2 crews and 2 machines will make 4 complete trips across that line, back and forth through the blind dark, smashing through drifts, scraping steel against steel, fighting to keep a single thread of railway alive. This is the story of one night on the Penistone line. A night when the difference between an open railway and a closed one came down to sheer grinding repetition. The winter of 1968 to 69 had been building its case for weeks. January brought persistent cold across northern England. Temperatures rarely climbed above freezing. The ground hardened. Rivers slowed. And then, in the second week of February, the snow arrived. Not the brief, decorative kind that melts by lunchtime. This was Pennine snow. Heavy, wind-driven, relentless. It came from the northwest, carried on winds that had gathered moisture crossing the Irish Sea, and it dumped that moisture across the high ground between Lancashire and Yorkshire with mechanical efficiency. The Penistone line sat directly in its path. Running from Huddersfield to Sheffield via Penistone, the line crossed some of the most exposed terrain in the British railway network. It climbed to over 700 feet above sea level at its highest point. The route traversed open moorland where there was nothing, absolutely nothing to break the wind. No trees, no buildings, no cuttings deep enough to offer shelter. Just bare, wind-swept hillside and iron rails. For the railway operations team at Healey Mills, this stretch was a permanent headache every winter, but February 1969 was shaping up to be something worse. The snow was not just falling, it was drifting. Winds gusting at 35 to 40 miles per hour were picking up fallen snow and packing it against every obstacle, every embankment, every cutting wall along the route. A section cleared at 8 in the evening could be blocked again by midnight. The traditional approach to snow clearance on British railways had not changed much in a century. You bolted a plough to the front of a locomotive and you drove it through the snow. Simple in theory, brutal in practice. The ploughs assigned to the Penistone operation were wedge-type snow ploughs, mounted on the buffer beams of 2 Class 37 diesel-electric locomotives. Each locomotive produced 1,750 horsepower from its English Electric 12-cylinder power unit. They weighed over 100 tons apiece. They were, by the standards of 1969, about the most powerful things the London Midland region could throw at the problem. But power alone meant nothing against physics. A wedge plough works by splitting the snow and throwing it to either side of the track. Now, this works beautifully when the snow is fresh and loose. It works less beautifully when the wind has packed that snow into dense, compacted drifts that have the consistency of wet concrete. Hit one of those at speed, and the locomotive does not cut through. It stops, sometimes violently. The crews knew this. Every man assigned to snowplough duty on the Pennine routes understood the risks. A sudden stop could throw the driver forward into the cab controls. Equipment could break loose, and if the locomotive became buried, you had a new problem entirely. Getting a 100-ton machine out of a drift in the dark on an exposed hillside in a blizzard was not a task anyone wanted to contemplate. The first trip began shortly before midnight. The 2 Class 37s moved out of Healey Mills in tandem, me heading west toward Huddersfield before turning south onto the Penistone line. The lead locomotive carried the plough. The second followed close behind, providing additional weight and power if the lead engine became stuck. They hit the first significant drift within 20 minutes. It was not dramatic. The driver felt the resistance build through the controls, felt the locomotive slow despite full power, heard the grinding roar of packed snow being forced aside by the steel plough. The engine note deepened. The wheels slipped momentarily, then bit again. They punched through, and then they hit the next one, and the next. The Penistone line that night was not one problem. It was dozens of problems stretched across miles of track, each one different from the last. Some drifts were shallow and soft, barely slowing the locomotives. Others were 4 or 5 feet deep, packed hard by the wind, requiring the drivers to back up and hit them again at higher speed. The cab conditions were appalling. Class 37 locomotives were not designed for comfort in the best of circumstances. The cabs were noisy, poorly heated, and offered limited visibility even in daylight. At night, in a blizzard, the crew could see almost nothing beyond the cone of the headlamp. Snow swirled in the beam, creating a disorienting white wall that made it impossible to judge distance or speed. The drivers relied on experience and instinct. They knew the line. They knew where the worst drift would form, which cuttings would fill first, which exposed sections would be scoured clean by the wind. This knowledge had been accumulated over years of winter operations, passed from driver to driver in the informal education system that existed in every locomotive depot in Britain. The first trip took nearly 2 hours. Under normal conditions, the run from Huddersfield to Penistone and on towards Sheffield took less than 45 minutes. That night, the 2 locomotives crawled through the darkness at an average speed of barely 15 miles per hour, stopping, reversing, attacking the same drift from different angles, grinding forward yard by painful yard. They reached the far end of the route sometime after 1 in the morning. The line behind them was clear, for now. But even as the crews paused to check their equipment and consult with the signalman, the snow was already filling in their tracks. The wind had not stopped. If anything, it had intensified. Fresh snow was falling at a rate of roughly 1 inch per hour, and the wind was adding to the drifts faster than gravity alone could account for. There was no discussion about whether to make a second trip. The question answered itself. The return journey began at approximately 1:30. This time, the crews faced the same drifts from the opposite direction. Snow that had been thrown to the left of the track on the outward journey had been partly blown back. New accumulations had formed in sections that had been clear just 90 minutes earlier. The second trip was harder than the first. Fatigue was beginning to tell. The physical demands of snowplough work are often underestimated. The constant vibration, the sudden jolts when the plough hits compacted snow, the need to maintain absolute concentration in conditions of near-zero visibility. It drains energy at a rate that desk-bound railway officials rarely appreciated. The drivers changed their approach for the second run. Instead of trying to clear every drift completely, they focused on maintaining a passable channel. Get the rails clear, get the flangeways open, do not worry about perfection, worry about keeping the line alive. They completed the second trip by roughly 3:15 in the morning. Behind them, the line was open, barely. A single track's width of cleared rail, with walls of snow rising on either side. It would hold, for a while. The third trip began at 4 in the morning. By now, the crews had settled into a grim rhythm, out and back, each trip a little harder than the last. Because the snow kept falling and the wind kept blowing and the drifts kept reforming with the mindless persistence of nature doing what nature does. The third trip encountered the worst conditions of the night. A drift near Denby Dale had built to an estimated 6 feet in depth, completely burying the track and the lower portions of the lineside fencing. The lead locomotive hit it at approximately 20 miles per hour and stopped dead within 30 yards. The force of the impact threw loose equipment across the cab floor. The crew reversed out. They backed up several hundred yards and tried again, this time at 25 miles per hour. The locomotive punched deeper into the drift but still failed to break through. Snow packed around the plough blade and climbed over the buffer beam, piling against the front of the locomotive. On the third attempt, with both locomotives coupled together and pushing in tandem, they broke through. The combined weight of over 200 tons of diesel locomotive, driven by 3,500 horsepower, forced a path through the drift. Snow exploded outward in the headlamp beams, a brief dramatic spectacle witnessed by no one except the exhausted men in the cabs. The third trip ended at approximately 5:30. The fourth and final trip began at 6 in the morning. Dawn was still more than an hour away. The snow had begun to ease slightly, though the wind remained strong. The drifts were still reforming, but more slowly now. The rate of accumulation had dropped. This last trip was both the easiest and the hardest. Easiest because the snow was finally letting up, while hardest because the crews had been working for 7 continuous hours in conditions that would test the endurance of anyone. They completed the fourth trip by 8 o'clock on the morning of February the 20th. By then, the first grey light of a winter dawn was creeping across the Pennines. revealing a landscape that looked like it belonged to another country entirely. White, featureless, vast. The railway line was visible only as a narrow dark thread cutting through the snow, marked by the banks of thrown snow on either side. The Penistone line was open. The first scheduled passenger service ran that morning, threading carefully along the cleared path at reduced speed. The passengers on that train almost certainly had no idea what had happened during the night. No idea that 2 locomotives and their crews had made 4 complete trips across the line while they slept, fighting through the dark to keep those rails clear. This was not unusual. Across the network that same night, similar operations were taking place on dozens of routes. Snowplough trains were working the lines across the Pennines, across the Scottish Highlands, across the Welsh hills. Every exposed route required its own dedicated clearance operation. The logistics were staggering. Locomotives had to be allocated, crews rostered, ploughs fitted, fuel supplies maintained, all coordinated through a system of telephone calls and handwritten messages passed between signal boxes and depots. The Penistone operation was just one small piece of a vast, improvised effort to keep Britain's railway network functioning through one of the worst winters in recent memory. What made the Penistone line operation notable was its sheer repetitiveness. 4 trips in one night on a single line. Not because of a catastrophic blockage, not because of a dramatic rescue, simply because the snow would not stop falling and someone had to keep pushing it aside. There was no crisis moment, no single heroic act, just hour after hour of grinding, repetitive, exhausting work carried out in appalling conditions by men who understood that if they stopped, the line would close, and if the line closed, the communities it served would be cut off. The Class 37s returned to Healey Mills on the morning of the 20th, their ploughs battered and caked with ice, their crews hollow-eyed with fatigue. The locomotives would be checked, refueled, and prepared for the possibility of another night's work. The crews would go home, sleep for a few hours and come back. Because the forecast said more snow was coming. It always did.